I never should have checked the exhumation records, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. My name is Vernon Hayes, and I have worked as a groundskeeper at Coldwater State Prison Cemetery in eastern Montana for 12 years. In that time, I've buried 417 inmates, maintained twice that many graves, and learned that consistency matters more than curiosity. The job is simple. Dig when they tell you to dig, fill when they tell you to fill, and don't ask questions about the men beneath the soil. That rule kept me employed longer than most. Until Plot 447. The plot sits in the northwest corner under a cluster of cottonwoods that never quite lose their leaves. I noticed it my first winter here. The snow melted faster around that section, creating a perfect square of dark earth while everything else stayed white for weeks. I mentioned it once to the warden. He told me soil composition varies. I didn't mention it again, but the exhumations started in 2012. The first was an inmate named Gerald Moss, buried in Plot 447 after a prison infirmary heart attack. 6 months later, a state order came through. No explanation, just coordinates and a date. I dug him up on a Tuesday morning, the casket vault surprisingly warm to the touch, despite the frozen ground. The transport team took him without a word. 3 months after that, another inmate went into 447. Joseph Ruiz, stabbed in the yard. 5 months later, another exhumation order. Then Marcus Webb, then Antonio Diaz, then Samuel Chen. Always Plot 447, always within 6 months, always by state order with no explanation. I started keeping my own records in a notebook I kept in my truck. Burial dates, exhumation dates, inmate names. I cross-referenced them with the cemetery's official logs during my lunch breaks, eating cold sandwiches while running my finger down columns of numbers. The pattern held: 12 years, 17 burials, 17 exhumations. The plot never stayed occupied longer than 6 months. Last January, I buried Thomas Waite there. Overdose in his cell, they said. I dug through frozen soil that felt oddly soft, almost warm. The vault went in clean. I filled the grave, tamped the earth, and marked it with the standard temporary marker. Then I went home and circled the date in my notebook. 6 months from then would be July. The exhumation order came in June. I arrived at dawn with my equipment, the cottonwoods rustling overhead despite the still air. The soil was warm again. I could feel it through my work gloves as I cleared the topsoil. Steam rose from the hole as I dug deeper, my breath fogging in the cool morning while the earth beneath me radiated heat. When I reached the vault, I stopped. The concrete was intact, no cracks or shifts, but along the top edge, near the seal, I saw scratches. Thin, deliberate lines carved into the concrete from the inside. 4 parallel marks, like fingernails dragging across stone. I called my supervisor. He told me to finish the job. The transport team arrived an hour later. They didn't comment on the scratches. They didn't comment on the warmth. They loaded the vault onto their truck and drove away, and I filled the hole again, packing the soil tight. That night, I went through my notebook. I'd documented every exhumation, but I'd never questioned where the bodies went. The state orders never specified a destination, just removal dates and authorization codes. I started calling coroners' offices, medical examiners, state facilities. Nobody had records of receiving bodies from Coldwater's Plot 447. A week later, the warden's office sent me new burial coordinates. Another inmate, another death. The plot number made my hands cold. Plot 447. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to ask why that plot, why always that plot, why the soil stayed warm, and why the bodies kept coming back to it. But I'd worked here 12 years. I knew better. I dug the grave on a Thursday. The earth was soft, almost eager, like it had been waiting. I could smell something beneath the turned soil. Not decay, but something mineral and old, like copper and stone. The seas went deeper than standard depth. I didn't question it. I just kept digging until my supervisor said, "Stop." The burial was scheduled for the next morning. That night, I parked my truck at the edge of the cemetery and waited. I told myself I was checking the perimeter, looking for vandalism. But I knew the truth. I needed to see Plot 447 in the dark. At 2 in the morning, I walked out to the northwest corner. The cottonwoods were completely still. No wind, no sound, just my footsteps on gravel and the distant hum of the prison's security lights. The fresh grave was a dark rectangle in the earth, waiting for tomorrow's casket. I stood at the edge and listened. At first, nothing. Then, soft, rhythmic, almost imperceptible, a sound like breathing, rising from the hole, slow and steady, in and out, patient as soil settling. I stepped back. The sound continued. I've filled that grave 4 times since then. 4 more inmates, 4 more exhumation orders. I don't keep records anymore. I don't ask questions. I dig when they tell me to dig, and I try not to notice that the soil gets warmer each time or that the scratches on the vault lids are getting deeper. But sometimes, late at night when I'm locking the equipment shed, I count the cottonwood trees in the northwest corner. There are always more than I remember. Some silences are louder than screams, and I learned that from a man who never spoke. My name is Mateo Reyes, and I have worked as a cemetery digger at Riverside State Penitentiary in southern Illinois for 8 years. In that time, I've buried over 200 inmates, men who died angry, men who died broken, men who died alone. Most of them had someone who cried at their funerals, even if it was just the chaplain. But inmate 73218 had nobody, not even tears, just silence, the way he'd lived for 30 years. The prison psychologist told me his story while I prepared the grave. Selective mutism, she called it. The inmate hadn't spoken a single word since his intake in 1994. Not in court, not to his cellmate, not even when the guards found him collapsed in the shower with a brain hemorrhage. He'd communicated through hand gestures and written notes for 3 decades, and then he died without making a sound. The burial was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. No service, no flowers, No witnesses, just me, the casket, and the hole I'd spent the morning digging in Section C, under the shadow of the old water tower. The chaplain didn't even show, said there was no point blessing a grave for a man who'd never asked for God. I lowered the casket myself using the manual winch, the chains creaking in the summer heat. The box settled into the earth with a soft thud, and I stood there for a moment, looking down at the plain pine coffin with its stamped prisoner number. It felt wrong, burying someone in that much silence. Even the birds had stopped singing. I filled the grave quickly, wanting to finish before the afternoon thunderstorms rolled in. The soil was dry and loose, easy to work. I tamped it down, raked it smooth, and placed the temporary marker, a simple metal stake with the prisoner number and death date. Then I cleaned my tools and drove the utility cart back to the shed. 3 nights later, I was doing my evening rounds. Riverside's cemetery sits on 12 acres behind the prison's east wall, and my job includes nightly perimeter checks. Mostly I'm looking for vandalism or deer damage, but really it's just an excuse to walk the grounds in peace before going home. That night was clear and cool, the kind of September evening that smells like cut grass and distant rain. I was checking the fence line near Section C when I heard it. Humming, low and rhythmic, rising from somewhere in the darkness ahead. I stopped walking, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows between headstones. The sound continued, a melody I almost recognized, something old and gentle, like a lullaby. My grandmother used to hum that song when I was small, rocking me to sleep in her kitchen chair. I followed the sound to the fresh grave in Section C, Inmate 73218's plot. The humming was coming from the earth itself, soft but unmistakable, rising and falling with perfect rhythm. I stood at the foot of the grave, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The humming stopped. I waited. 5 minutes, 10. Nothing but crickets and the distant hum of the prison generators. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The wind through the fence, a bird call I'd misheard, anything rational. I went home and slept poorly, dreaming of my grandmother's kitchen and a melody I couldn't quite remember. The next night, I heard it again. Same time, same place. The humming rose from the grave like steam, that same gentle lullaby, patient and endless. I knelt beside the plot, pressing my ear to the soil. The sound was clearer down there, not just humming, but the subtle vibration of vocal cords, the resonance of breath through a human throat. I called my supervisor. He drove out with coffee and skepticism, stood beside the grave, and heard nothing. The humming had stopped the moment his truck's headlights swept across Section C. He told me to get some sleep, suggested maybe I was working too many doubles. I nodded and thanked him, and after he left, the humming started again. I began visiting the grave every night. I told myself I was investigating, documenting, being thorough, but the truth was simpler and stranger. The humming was beautiful. It filled the cemetery's silence with something gentle, something human. After 8 years of burying men in quiet graves, it felt almost like company. On the 7th night, I brought my phone and recorded it. The playback was clear, 3 minutes and 42 seconds of that soft, rhythmic melody rising and falling like breath. I sent it to the prison psychologist. She called me within an hour. Where did you get this recording? The grave, Section C, the inmate who never spoke, silence on the line. Then, Mateo, that's the song his mother used to sing to him. She testified about it during his trial, said she sang it every night before he stopped talking. I asked how she knew that. She said it was in his file, a detail from the psychiatric evaluation 30 years ago. His mother had died when he was 9 years old. The humming continued every night for 2 weeks. Then it changed. On the 15th night, I arrived to find the melody different, slower, sadder, like it was winding down. The rhythm faltered, the pitch dropped. By the end of the 3rd week, it had become barely audible, just a whisper of breath beneath the soil. On the 21st night, it stopped completely. I stood at the grave for an hour, waiting, listening, nothing, just silence again, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I haven't heard the humming since, but sometimes, when I'm digging new graves in Section C, I find myself humming that melody without realizing it, the one my grandmother used to sing, the one that rose from the earth where a silent man was buried. And sometimes, late at night, when the cemetery is empty, I wonder if he was trying to say goodbye, or if he was just finally learning to speak. I still don't know which answer frightens me more. The woman in the yellow dress arrives every Sunday at exactly 5 in the morning, and I've never been able to ask her name. My name is Richard Simmons, and I have served as caretaker at Greenfield State Prison Cemetery in northern Ohio for 19 years. In that time, I've maintained 400 graves, managed visiting hours, and learned to recognize the patterns of grief. Mothers visit on Sundays, wives on Saturdays. Children, when they come at all, choose weekdays when fewer people are watching. But the woman in yellow follows no pattern I understand. I first noticed her in March of 2023. I arrived for my early shift at 4:30, unlocking the cemetery gates and checking the grounds before official visiting hours began at 8. The morning was cold and gray, fog rolling across the flat Indiana headstones like smoke. I was inspecting the northeast section when I saw her, a woman in a bright yellow dress, standing beside a grave in row 12, placing white carnations on the soil. I called out, asking if she needed help. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me at all, just straightened the flowers, stood there for a moment with her head bowed, and then walked toward the far exit gate. I followed, intending to remind her that the cemetery wasn't open yet, but by the time I reached the gate, she was gone. The access road was empty. No car, no footprints in the dew-wet grass. Just fog and silence. I checked the grave. Fresh white carnations, the cheap kind from grocery stores, arranged in a neat bundle. The headstone was a standard prison marker, inmate number 6, 4-7. 9-2, no name, no dates. I took note of the plot number and went back to my office. The burial records showed the inmate had died in May of 2001, 22 years earlier. Cause of death, complications from pneumonia. Next of kin, none listed, no approved visitors during his incarceration, no memorial service, no flowers at burial. He'd died alone and been buried alone, in isolation that extended beyond death. The following Sunday, she was there again. Same time, same yellow dress, same white carnations. I approached more carefully this time, moving slowly through the rows of graves. She stood motionless at the plot, her back to me, her dress unnaturally bright against the gray morning. I got within 10 feet before she turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog before I could call out. This time, I ran after her, followed her path through the cemetery, found nothing. I started arriving earlier, 4 in the morning, then 3:30. It didn't matter. Every Sunday at 5, she appeared at that grave with fresh flowers. Always the same yellow dress, always the same white carnations, always gone before I could reach her. I reviewed the inmate's file more carefully. His name was Marcus Webb, sentenced in 1996 for armed robbery. No family contact information, no correspondence logs, no visitor requests in 5 years of incarceration. The medical records showed he died quietly in the infirmary, surrounded by nurses who didn't know his story. I searched obituaries, court records, anything that might explain who would visit his grave with such dedication. I found nothing. No Marcus Webb with family in yellow dresses, no white carnation traditions, nothing. Then I installed a camera. The prison approved my request to place a security camera aimed at row 12, ostensibly to monitor for vandalism. The footage would be archived and reviewed weekly. I told them it was routine maintenance. They didn't ask questions. The first Sunday after installation, I watched the recording. At 4:58, the frame was empty, just graves and fog. At 4:59, the woman appeared, not walking into frame, not approaching from any direction, just suddenly there, standing beside the grave, as if she'd materialized from the fog itself. She placed the flowers, she bowed her head. At 5:03, she walked toward the east fence and vanished before reaching it. I showed the footage to the prison warden. He watched it twice, his face carefully neutral. Then he told me not to document it in official reports. Said some things didn't need explanations, just acceptance. I asked what he meant. He closed the file and told me to maintain the cemetery as usual, but I couldn't accept it. I started researching Marcus Webb's case history, digging through archived trial transcripts and court documents. Found a detail buried in his sentencing hearing. He'd been arrested leaving his daughter's 5th birthday party, still holding a yellow balloon. His ex-wife testified against him. His daughter was kept from all contact. The judge ruled it was in the child's best interest. Her name was Emma, born in 1991. She would have been 32 years old now. I searched social media, found an Emma Webb in Columbus, Ohio. Her profile showed a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a fondness for vintage yellow dresses. Her latest post was a photo of white carnations with the caption, "For the parent I never got to know." It was posted at 5:07 on a Sunday morning. I wanted to contact her, ask if she'd been visiting the cemetery, if she knew about the cameras, if she understood what I'd seen. But something stopped me. The Emma Webb posting on social media was tagged at a coffee shop 40 miles away at exactly the same time the woman in yellow appeared at the grave. The same Sunday I watched the security footage showed Emma Webb checking in at a restaurant in Columbus at 5 in the morning. She was having breakfast with friends, documented in photos. She couldn't have been in both places. I stopped trying to explain it. The woman still comes every Sunday at 5. I've stopped approaching her. The flowers are always fresh, always white carnations. The cameras still record her arrival and departure, each time the same impossible appearance and disappearance. Last week, I found myself leaving fresh water in a vase near the grave before dawn. I tell myself it's professional courtesy, maintaining the grounds properly. But I think Marcus Webb's daughter, whether the woman in yellow is Emma or something Emma's grief created, deserves someone to acknowledge her visits, even if I don't understand how she makes them. The warden handed me coordinates for a grave that shouldn't exist, and I dug it in anyway. My name is Marcus Hale, and I have worked as groundskeeper at Blackstone Correctional Facility in western Pennsylvania for 14 years. In that time, I've learned that the prison cemetery operates on its own logic, plots assigned by bureaucracy, not geography, burials scheduled by death certificates, not available space. The system works as long as nobody questions it. I never questioned it until row J, slot 12. The work order came through on a Tuesday morning. Standard burial request, 1 inmate, natural causes, plot assignment. Row J, slot 12. I filed the paperwork and pulled out the cemetery map, a laminated grid showing every row, every slot, every occupied grave going back to 1973. Row J ended at slot 8. I checked the map 3 times, counted the physical markers in row J. 8 graves, 8 slots, all occupied and documented. There was no slot 9, no slot 10, no slot 12. The row terminated at a drainage culvert, beyond which the land dropped away into a steep wooded ravine. I called the administrative office, told them there must be a clerical error. The woman on the phone put me on hold, came back 5 minutes later, and confirmed row J, slot 12. The warden had personally approved the assignment. When I explained the slot didn't exist, she suggested I check the southern boundary. I drove the utility cart to row J's southern end. Nothing but the drainage culvert, chain link fence, and forest beyond. I walked the perimeter twice, checking for markers I'd missed, hidden plots, anything that would explain the assignment. Then I saw the space. Between slot 8 and the culvert, there was a gap I'd never noticed before, a section of flat ground approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, just wide enough for a grave. It wasn't on the map. It had no marker, no disturbed soil, no indication it had ever been used. But the measurements were exact, as if someone had planned for it decades ago and simply never recorded it. I reported back to the office. They told me to dig. The ground was soft, easier than it should have been for soil that supposedly hadn't been touched in 50 years. My shovel sank deep on the first strike, cutting through earth that felt loose and warm. I worked methodically, clearing the topsoil, digging down to the standard 6-foot depth for vault placement. At 4 feet, my shovel hit something solid. I knelt and brushed away the soil. Concrete, gray and weathered, but unmistakably a vault lid. I cleared more dirt, exposing the edges, confirming what I already knew, but didn't want to believe. There was already a casket buried in row J, slot 12. I stopped digging and called my supervisor. He arrived 20 minutes later with the warden, both of them standing at the edge of the hole, looking down at the concrete vault that wasn't supposed to be there. The warden asked if I'd checked the map. I showed him. He studied it, then looked at the vault, then back at the map. He told me to open it. I wanted to refuse. Every instinct said to fill the hole, mark it as unusable, and assign the burial to a different plot. But I'd worked at Blackstone for 14 years. I knew how orders worked. I cleared the remaining soil and used a pry bar to break the vault seal. The concrete came away in pieces, old, but not degraded. Inside was a casket, plain pine, standard prison issue, exactly like the ones we still used. No nameplate, no markings, just wood and rust-stained hinges. The warden told me to check for identification. I lifted the casket lid, my hands shaking despite the cool morning air. The interior was empty, except for a thin layer of dust and a small brass plate riveted to the satin lining. The engraving was simple. Row J, slot 12, reserved. Not a name, not a date, just the plot designation and that single word. The warden studied the plate for a long time. Then he told me to leave the vault open, bury the new casket directly on top of the existing one, and seal everything. When I asked whose casket was already there, he said some records were too old to matter. I lowered the new casket that afternoon. It settled into the vault with a soft scrape of wood on wood, resting directly above the empty one. I sealed the vault, filled the grave, and placed the temporary marker. The whole time, I kept thinking about that brass plate. Reserved. Reserved for what? For whom? And why had the map never shown it? That night, I went through the cemetery's archived records, looking for any mention of Row J, Slot 12. Found burial logs going back to the prison's opening in 1973. Row J was established in 1981, 8 graves allocated and filled by 1997. No slot 12, no reserved plots, no gaps in the sequence. But I found something else. A maintenance report from 2009, signed by my predecessor, the groundskeeper, who'd retired 6 months before I was hired. A single line entry. Row J drainage culvert relocated south 6 feet, soil reclamation complete. 6 feet south would have placed the culvert exactly where I'd found the empty vault. I measured it the next day. The current culvert was indeed 6 feet south of where the engineering plans said it should be, and where it used to be, where water should have made the ground unstable and unsuitable for burial, there was now perfect, undisturbed soil, except for Row J, Slot 12. I haven't told anyone what I found. The warden made it clear some questions don't need answers. But sometimes, late at night when I'm locking the equipment shed, I think about that brass plate and that single word, reserved, and I wonder if the slot was reserved, who knew it was there? Who planned for it decades before the burial? And most importantly, why did the vault's viewing window have condensation on the inside when I opened it, as if something had been breathing in there until the moment I broke the seal? I've stopped checking row J on my evening rounds. Some graves are better left alone. The transfer note was simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. Do not open casket. My name is Daniel Chen, and I have worked as a cemetery digger at Redwood State Penitentiary in Northern California for 6 years. In that time, I've handled 342 burials, each with its own paperwork, protocols, and peculiarities. Some inmates arrive with detailed funeral instructions. Some arrive with nothing. But I'd never seen a casket arrive with a warning like that, typed in capital letters and stamped 3 times across the transfer documentation. The body belonged to Inmate 49763, transferred from a maximum security facility 200 miles south. The paperwork listed cause of death as medical complications, which could mean anything from a heart attack to a prison yard stabbing that went sideways. The transfer was routine, except for that note. Do not open casket. I signed for the delivery at 6 in the morning, watching as the transport team unloaded the casket from their van. It was a standard issue metal box, sealed and locked, heavier than most. The driver handed me the clipboard, pointed to the warning, and told me it came from the state medical examiner. No viewing, no verification, just burial. I asked why. He said he didn't know and didn't want to know. Then he drove away. The burial was scheduled for noon. I spent the morning preparing the grave in Section F, digging through clay soil that clung to my shovel like wet concrete. The weather was overcast and humid, the kind of morning where your shirt sticks to your back and the air feels too thick to breathe properly. I worked steadily, marking the depth, preparing the vault, checking the measurements twice. At 11:30, I drove the utility cart back to the maintenance building to retrieve the casket. It had shifted. I'd left it centered on the steel transport table, positioned lengthwise, with the head facing east, according to protocol. Now it sat at an angle, rotated maybe 15 degrees, with one corner hanging slightly over the table's edge. I stopped in the doorway, studying the scene. The floor was concrete, level and clean. Nobody else had access to the building. I had the only key. And the casket weighed at least 300 pounds, fully loaded. I circled the table, checking for seismic activity, foundation settling, anything that would explain the shift. Nothing. The building was perfectly still. The casket just sat there at its impossible angle, slightly askew, waiting. I straightened it carefully, pushing it back to center. The metal was cold despite the humid air, cold enough that my palms ached from the contact. I secured it to the cart with transport straps and drove it out to Section F, trying to ignore the way it felt heavier than it should, like the weight inside was redistributing itself with every bump in the path. Halfway to the grave, I felt it shift again. Not a slide or a roll, just a subtle redistribution of weight, like something inside had moved from one end of the casket to the other. The cart tilted slightly, then corrected. I stopped draping and stood there for a full minute, my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the casket in my rearview mirror. It was perfectly still. I continued driving, slower now, watching the casket in the mirror. No more movement, just that cold metal box strapped to my cart, reflecting the gray sky like brushed steel. At the grave, I positioned the cart beside the vault and prepared the mechanical lowering device. The casket would rest on canvas straps, then descend slowly into the earth on a hand-cranked winch. Simple, controlled routine. As I attached the straps, I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, evenly spaced, from inside the casket. I stepped back, my hands dropping from the metal surface. The sound was unmistakable, not settling, not expansion from temperature change, but deliberate percussion, knuckles on metal, human rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds. The cemetery was completely silent, except for my own breathing and the distant hum of the prison's perimeter fence. No birds, no wind, just me and that casket, and those 3 deliberate knocks that echoed in my chest like a second heartbeat. I thought about the note. Do not open casket. I thought about the transfer paperwork, the lack of details, the medical examiner's unusual involvement. I thought about the shift in the maintenance building and the weight redistribution on the cart. Then I thought about my job, my responsibilities, and the fact that some protocols exist for reasons nobody explains. I secured the straps and lowered the casket into the vault. It descended smoothly, the winch clicking in steady rhythm. 6 feet down, the canvas went slack. The casket settled with a soft thud. I released the straps and pulled them free, then sealed the vault with concrete lid panels. The whole process took 15 minutes. No more knocks, no more movement, just silence and the smell of fresh turned earth. I filled the grave quickly, working faster than usual, tamping the soil in layers until the plot was level and complete. Placed the temporary marker, cleaned my tools, drove the cart back to the maintenance building. That evening, I filed the paperwork. Burial complete, no complications. Standard protocol followed. I didn't mention the knocks, didn't mention the shifting, didn't mention the way the casket had felt cold in 90-degree weather or how the weight seemed to move inside it. Because some things don't need to be reported. Some warnings exist to protect the living, not the dead. But now, 3 months later, I still drive past Section F on my rounds. Still check the grave during my evening perimeter walks. The plot is undisturbed, the soil settled and packed, the markers straight and clean. Except sometimes, late at night when the cemetery is empty and the fog rolls in from the coast, I swear I can hear it. 3 slow knocks rising from the earth, deliberate, patient, waiting, and every time I hear them, I'm grateful I followed that warning and kept the casket closed. Some promises are kept even after death, and I learned that from a man who had 3 minutes left to live. My name is Luis Navarro, and I have worked as a cemetery technician at Crossroads State Penitentiary in western Texas for 11 years. In that time, I've coordinated 237 burials, maintained plot records, and assisted with final arrangements for inmates who died in custody. Most of my work happens after death: paperwork, grave assignments, coordination with transport teams. But occasionally, I'm called to witness executions. Protocol requires a cemetery representative present to verify body transfer and burial instructions. I've witnessed 12 executions. Only one of them ever spoke to me directly. His name was Raymond Cortez, scheduled for lethal injection on a Thursday evening in October of 2022. I arrived at the facility at 7, signed in with security, and took my position in the witness gallery, a small room separated from the execution chamber by reinforced glass. The protocol is simple: watch, verify identity, confirm death, coordinate body transfer. Raymond was already strapped to the gurney when I entered, IV lines inserted, chaplain finishing final prayers. He was 47 years old, convicted of murder 15 years earlier. The warden read the death warrant, asked if he had final words. Raymond's eyes scanned the witness gallery, moving from family members to reporters to official witnesses. Then they stopped on me. He shouldn't have known who I was. I wore no identification, held no official role in the proceedings. But somehow he knew. "You," he said, his voice barely audible through the intercom. "Cemetery man." I didn't respond. Protocol discourages interaction. "I'll see you at the planting," he said. Then he smiled. The injection began at 7:14. He was pronounced dead at 7:23. I signed the verification paperwork and coordinated with the medical examiner for body transfer. The burial was scheduled for 2 days later, Saturday morning, in the prison cemetery's southeast corner. I tried to forget what he'd said, tried to classify it as final words from a dying man, meaningless syllables spoken under extreme stress. But the planting was unusual terminology: not burial, not funeral, but planting, like he was a seed going into soil. The burial proceeded without incident. No family attended, just me, the chaplain, and 2 guards as witnesses. I supervised the lowering of the casket, verified the plot coordinates, and signed the completion forms. By noon, Raymond Cortez was 6 feet under Texas clay, and I went home to forget about him. 3 days later, I noticed my work gloves were missing. I'd left them in my truck after the burial, draped over the passenger seat like always. They weren't expensive, just standard leather work gloves, worn and stained from years of cemetery maintenance. But they were mine, and they were gone. I searched the truck twice, checked the equipment shed, retraced my steps. Nothing. I bought a new pair and continued working. A week after the burial, I did my routine Monday morning inspection, checking for vandalism, verifying plot markers, ensuring everything was in order after the weekend. I started in the northwest corner and worked my way systematically through each section. When I reached the southeast corner, I saw them: my work gloves, laid neatly on Raymond Cortez's grave, positioned side by side, fingers pointing toward the headstone. They were exactly as I'd last seen them. Same stains, same wear patterns, same small tear on the left thumb. I picked them up slowly, my hands shaking despite the warm morning. The leather was cold, colder than it should have been sitting in direct sunlight. I checked the surrounding area for footprints, tire tracks, any indication of how they'd gotten there. The ground was undisturbed except for my own footprints approaching the grave. I took the gloves to the security office and reviewed the weekend camera footage. The cemetery had 3 cameras covering major access points and high traffic areas. Raymond's grave sat just outside camera range, positioned in a blind spot near the southern fence line, but one camera caught the southeast corner peripherally. I reviewed the footage from Saturday night through Monday morning. Nothing. No movement, no visitors, just empty cemetery and shadows shifting with the sun. Yet somehow, my gloves had traveled from my missing property to Raymond Cortez's grave. I reported it to my supervisor. He suggested someone was playing a prank, maybe a coworker who'd found the gloves and placed them there as a joke. I asked who would have access to my truck. He said I should lock it better. I started locking everything: truck, equipment shed, office. I bought a small lockbox for personal items and kept it chained to my desk. The gloves went into my locker at home, and I wore a different pair to work. 2 weeks passed without incident. Then I found them again. Same grave, same position, neatly laid out, fingers pointing toward the headstone. This time, I knew with absolute certainty they'd been locked in my home locker 40 miles from the cemetery. I'd checked that morning before leaving for work. I didn't report it the second time, didn't review camera footage, didn't ask questions. I just picked up the gloves and took them home, and that night I burned them in my backyard fire pit, watching the leather curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. The next morning, I bought a third pair of work gloves. I've worn them for 9 months now, and they've never gone missing. I've never found anything unusual on Raymond Cortez's grave. The plot is clean, maintained, unremarkable, but I've changed my routine. I no longer do Monday morning inspections in the southeast corner. I assign that section to my assistant, a younger technician who doesn't ask questions about why I avoid certain graves. When burials are scheduled near Raymond's plot, I coordinate from the office instead of supervising directly, and I've stopped witnessing executions. When the warden's office calls requesting cemetery representation at proceedings, I cite scheduling conflicts. They've stopped asking, because sometimes, late at night when I'm closing the office, I think about Raymond's final words. I'll see you at the planting. Not a threat, not a warning, just a simple statement of fact, spoken by a man who somehow knew I'd be the one handling his burial. And I wonder, did he see me at the planting? Is he still seeing me every morning when I drive past his grave on my way to the equipment shed? I don't have answers, but I keep my current work gloves locked in my truck's center console, and I never leave them unattended. Some promises transcend death, and some men keep appointments even from 6 feet under. Security cameras don't lie, But they don't always tell the truth either. My name is Iris Thompson, and I have worked as groundskeeper at Elmwood State Prison Cemetery in central Georgia for 17 years. In that time, I've maintained 600 graves, managed seasonal landscaping, and learned that isolation changes people in ways that outlive them. Most inmates die with someone who cares, a mother, a sister, someone who sends letters and asks about burial arrangements. But some die completely alone, and those burials are the ones that stay with me. Inmate 82471 was one of those. He died on a Wednesday morning in June, massive stroke in the prison library. No next of kin listed, no approved visitors in 18 years of incarceration. No letters, no phone calls, no contact with anyone outside the walls. The prison social worker told me he'd been estranged from his family since his sentencing, all ties severed by choice or circumstance. He would be buried without ceremony, without flowers, without witnesses. I prepared the grave on Friday morning, Section D, Plot 33. The ground was soft from overnight rain, easy to dig. I worked steadily through the humid morning, cutting through red Georgia clay, marking the depth, preparing the vault. By noon, everything was ready. The burial happened at 2 in the afternoon. Just me and the transport team, lowering a plain pine casket into the earth. No chaplain, no words spoken. The whole process took 12 minutes. I filled the grave, tamped the soil, placed the temporary marker, then I cleaned my tools and went home. Monday morning, the security office called. They wanted me to review some footage. Elmwood installed cameras throughout the cemetery 2 years earlier after a vandalism incident involving toppled headstones. 6 cameras covering major sections, motion activated, recording to a central server. The system was reliable but not comprehensive. Plenty of blind spots existed between camera ranges. Plot 33 sat squarely in Camera 4's field of view. The security officer pulled up the footage from Saturday night, 2:17 in the morning. The timestamp glowed in the bottom corner as grainy black and white images filled the monitor. Empty cemetery, neat rows of headstones, fresh grave in the center frame. Then the figures appeared, 7 of them, standing in a perfect circle around Plot 33. They didn't walk into frame, they were simply there, as if the camera had blinked and missed their arrival, all facing inward toward the grave, completely motionless, no movement, no gesture, just standing. The security officer let the footage play. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5. The figures never moved, never shifted position, just stood there in their circle, 7 dark shapes surrounding fresh earth. At 2:23, they vanished, not walking away, not dispersing, just gone. The cemetery empty again, as if they'd never existed. I asked to see it again. The officer replayed the segment. Same thing. Appearance at 2:17, motionless standing, disappearance at 2:23. 6 minutes of impossible vigil. I reviewed the burial logs. Inmate 82471. 1 had no registered next of kin, no approved visitors during his entire incarceration, no family contact information on file. The prison records showed he'd died alone, lived alone, and requested no memorial service. Yet 7 people had stood around his grave in the middle of the night. I asked the security officer about other camera angles. He pulled up cameras 3 and 5, which covered adjacent sections. Both showed the same thing: 7 figures appearing at 2:17, standing motionless, disappearing at 2:23. The angles were different, but the formation was identical, a perfect circle, everyone facing inward. I requested visitor logs for the weekend. The cemetery's main gate had been locked since Friday evening, security sealed until Monday morning. No approved visits, no recorded entries, no signs of forced entry or fence breaching. The figures had appeared inside a locked cemetery, stood for 6 minutes, and vanished without leaving footprints in the soft soil. I drove out to Plot 33 that afternoon. The grave was undisturbed, the soil settled and clean. I circled the plot, checking for shoe prints, disturbances, any physical evidence of visitors. Nothing. The grass around the grave was pristine, showing only my own footprints from the burial. But something was different. At the head of the grave, 7 white stones had been placed in a neat row. Small, smooth river rocks, perfectly matched in size and color. They hadn't been there Friday. I'd placed the temporary marker myself, verified the plot was clean. These stones were new. I collected them carefully, photographing their position before disturbing anything. Took them back to my office and examined them under proper lighting. Just ordinary river rocks, the kind you'd find in any Georgia stream. Nothing carved, nothing painted, nothing to indicate their significance. I showed them to the chaplain. He studied them quietly, turning them over in his hands. Then he asked about the inmate's background. I pulled the file: 18 years for manslaughter, 7 victims in a drunk driving accident, a family of 4 in one car, 3 teenagers in another, 7 victims, 7 stones, 7 figures standing vigil. I wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, wanted to believe someone had placed those stones as a memorial, that the camera footage showed legitimate mourners who'd somehow bypassed security. But the math was too perfect, the timing too precise. I checked the inmates' court records, found the victims' names, cross-referenced them with death certificates. All 7 had died on the same night in 2005, 21 years earlier. None had surviving family members listed in current databases. The youngest victim had been 16, the oldest 42. That night, I reviewed the camera footage again on my personal laptop at home, studied each figure individually, looking for identifying features. The image quality was poor, just dark shapes against darker background. But in one frame, enhanced and brightened, I could see a detail I'd missed before. One of the figures was small, chode-sized, standing between 2 taller figures like they were holding hands. I've kept the 7 stones in my office drawer. I haven't placed them back on the grave, but I haven't thrown them away either. They sit there, wrapped in tissue paper, a reminder that some vigils happen outside human observation. The cameras caught them again last month. Same time, same formation, same 6-minute appearance. I didn't report it, didn't review the footage with security. Just noted the timestamp in my private log and checked the grave the next morning. 7 new stones, white and smooth, arranged in a perfect row. I leave them now. Each month they appear, I photograph them for my records and leave them in place. It seems like the respectful thing to do, acknowledging witnesses to a man who died with no one, attended by the same people whose lives he ended. The cameras keep recording, the figures keep appearing, and I've stopped trying to explain what can't be explained. Some vigils transcend death, and some debts are paid in ways we'll never fully understand. Numbers don't change on their own, and I've reset that marker 11 times, trying to prove otherwise. My name is Marcus Webb, and I have worked as a cemetery digger at Riverside Correctional Institution in northern Minnesota for 9 years. In that time, I've learned that temporary grave markers follow a simple pattern: prisoner number, death date, burial date. The metal stakes are stamped at the prison's workshop, verified by records, and placed within 24 hours of burial. The numbers never change. They're stamped metal, permanent as gravestone engravings, until Inmate 174089. The burial happened on a Tuesday in late September. Standard protocol: 1 inmate, natural causes, unmarked grave in Section E. The temporary marker arrived with the casket, stamped with the prisoner number 174089. I verified it against the burial paperwork before placing it. The numbers matched perfectly. Wednesday morning, I did my routine inspection, checking plots for settling, verifying markers, documenting new graves. When I reached Section E, the marker for yesterday's burial was lying face down in the grass. I picked it up, assuming wind or animal activity had knocked it over. But the marker was heavy, solid metal stake, designed to withstand weather. It would take significant force to dislodge it from packed soil. I reset it, driving the stake deep, tamping the earth around it. Made a note in my inspection log: Section E, Plot 174089, marker reset. Thursday morning, it was face down again. Same plot, same position, lying flat in the grass, with the stake pulled completely free from the soil. I examined the ground carefully. No footprints, no signs of disturbance except the displaced marker. The surrounding plots were undisturbed, their markers standing straight and secure. I reset it again, this time drifting the stake 18 inches deep, deeper than standard protocol. Packed the soil hard, tested the stability by pulling on it with both hands. It didn't budge. Friday morning, face down. I began documenting with photographs. Time-stamped images showing the marker in position after reset, then the next morning's discovery lying in the grass. I reviewed security camera footage from the overnight hours. Section E sat in a blind spot between cameras, no coverage except for distant peripheral views. Nothing useful. I reset the marker for the 4th time and reported the issue to my supervisor. He suggested vandalism, kids from town jumping the fence after dark. I pointed out that only this marker was being targeted, that no other graves showed signs of interference. He told me to keep monitoring it. Over the next week, I reset that marker 7 more times, each morning face down, always the same position, stake pulled clean from the earth, lying flat with the numbers favoring the soil. On the 11th reset, I noticed something wrong. The prisoner number had changed, not all of it, just the last digit. The marker now read 174088 instead of 174089. I stared at it for a full minute, convinced I was misreading stamped metal, but the number was clear, 174088, one digit different from what I'd been resetting for 2 weeks. I retrieved my documentation photos from my phone, scrolled back to the first day. Every photograph clearly showed 174,089. I checked the burial paperwork in my office, inmate number 174,089, but the marker in my hand read 174088. I contacted the prison's records department, asked them to verify prisoner number 174088. They put me on hold, came back 5 minutes later with confusion in their voice. Number 174,088 didn't exist in their system. Never had. The numbering sequence jumped from 174,087 to 174,089, with no inmate assigned to 174,088. I asked why. They said it must be a database error, a skipped number in the original system implementation. They'd check historical records and get back to me. They never did. I reset the marker that afternoon, driving it deep and documenting the number 174088. The next morning, it was face down again. I photographed it before picking it up, then examined the stamped number. The digit had changed again, counting backward. I cross-referenced with the records department. Inmate 174087 had died 3 years earlier, buried in Section C with his own properly placed marker. This made no sense. I called the prison workshop that manufactured the markers, described the situation. The supervisor told me stamped metal doesn't change. The numbers are pressed into the steel during fabrication, permanent and immutable. If the number was different, it was a different marker. But I'd been resetting the same marker for 2 weeks. Same stake, same weathering patterns, same small dent on the upper edge where it had been dropped during delivery. Over the next month, I documented the progression. Each morning, the marker was face down. Each morning, the number decreased by 174,086, 174,085, 174,084. Counting backward through prisoner numbers, some that existed in records, some that didn't. At 174,075, I stopped resetting it, left it lying in the grass, face down, and placed a different marker, a wooden stake with the correct number painted by hand. The wooden marker stayed upright. The metal one remained face down, but the number kept changing. I checked it weekly, photographing the stamped digits. The countdown continued whether I touched it or not. 174,070, 174,065, 174,060, moving steadily backward through numbers spanning decades of prison operations. I researched the original Inmate 174089, the man buried in that plot. His file showed standard information: robbery conviction, 20-year sentence, heart failure at age 63. Nothing unusual except one detail buried in his intake paperwork. He'd requested prisoner number 174088 during processing, said it was his lucky number, the combination to his high school locker. The request was denied. Protocol didn't allow inmates to choose their numbers. He was assigned 174,089 instead, the number the marker was trying to become. I've stopped resetting it. The metal stake lies in the grass beside the grave, counting backward through prison history, one digit at a time. The wooden replacement stands upright, marking the plot officially. But sometimes, during morning inspections, I check the metal marker's progress. Last week, it reached 174,000, a prisoner number from 1987, before digital records, before the current numbering system existed. I searched archival paper files in the prison's basement storage, found no record of inmate 174,000, just a gap in the handwritten ledgers, a skipped entry with no explanation. The countdown continues. Each week, another decrease. And I've started wondering, what happens when it reaches zero? When the numbers run out completely? I don't know if I want to find out. But I keep checking, keep photographing, keep documenting this impossible thing happening in slow motion. Some markers point to the dead. Some point to something else entirely, and some count backward to a number that was never supposed to exist. Trees grow slowly in prison cemeteries, and what came up from Plot 18 grew faster than anything natural. My name is Raymond Davis, and I have worked as caretaker at Pinewood State Prison Cemetery in eastern Louisiana for 22 years. In that time, I've managed over 700 burials, maintained landscaping across 15 acres, and learned that soil reveals secrets at its own pace. The cemetery has old oaks, magnolias that bloom pink each spring, and carefully maintained grass between uniform rows of graves. The trees follow normal growth patterns, slow, predictable, governed by seasons. Until 3 weeks after we buried inmate 62947. The inmate's name was Thomas Greaves, 68 years old, died of pneumonia in the prison infirmary. No family, no service, buried on a humid Thursday afternoon in Plot 18, Section G, standard concrete vault, pine casket, 6 feet of Louisiana clay packed tight. I supervised the burial personally, made sure everything was done properly. The plot sat between 2 mature oaks, shaded and quiet, marked with a temporary metal stake. 3 weeks later, I noticed the crack. The concrete vault cover had split cleanly down the middle, a fracture running lengthwise across the surface. Vault failures happened occasionally: ground settling, water pressure, manufacturing defects. But this crack was fresh, the edges sharp and clean, and something was growing through it. A root, thick as my wrist, dark wood pushing up through concrete like it was paper. I knelt beside the grave and examined it carefully. The root had grown vertically through the vault, broken the concrete, and emerged into daylight. The growth was impossible. Roots don't move that fast, don't break through sealed concrete vaults, don't appear within weeks of burial. But there it was, undeniable and wrong. I contacted my supervisor, sent photographs, documented everything. He authorized removal and vault inspection, said it was probably an existing tree root that had coincidentally intersected the new grave, that we'd need to cut it back and reinforce the vault. I brought a chainsaw the next morning. The root had grown overnight, now thick as my thigh, rising 2 feet above ground, curving slightly toward the nearest oak. The bark was dark, almost black, rough textured and warm to the touch, despite the cool morning air. I positioned the chainsaw blade against the wood and pulled the trigger. The saw bit into the root easily, cutting clean. Sawdust sprayed, dark and fine. The smell hit me immediately. Not wood, not bark, but copper, sharp and metallic, like cutting into wet metal. I stopped sawing and stepped back. The root's cross-section was visible where I'd cut. Dark wood ringed with growth patterns, normal tree anatomy, except for the sap. It was seeping from the cut, thick and dark, running down the root's surface. When it hit the ground, it left red stains in the grass. I touched it carefully with a gloved finger, brought it close to my face. The smell was unmistakable. Blood. Not sap, not tree resin, blood, or something so close to blood that the difference didn't matter. I completed the cut, severing the root completely. The piece fell away, and more of that dark liquid poured from the stump, pooling on the fractured vault cover. I stood there watching it flow, my chainsaw idle, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I looked at the cross-section more carefully. The growth rings were wrong. Instead of concentric circles marking years of growth, the interior showed something else, a pattern that looked disturbingly organic, not wood grain, but something that resembled muscle tissue, striated and fibrous. And at the very center, where the heartwood should have been, there was a hollow space roughly the size and shape of a human finger. I took photographs and sealed the root section in a plastic bag. Documented everything, filed a detailed report with my supervisor, including images of the blood-like sap and the anatomically wrong interior structure. His response came 2 hours later. Remove the rest of the root, reinforce the vault, reseal the grave. No further investigation needed. When I asked about laboratory analysis of the sap, he told me it wasn't necessary. Just finish the job. I excavated the vault that afternoon, using a backhoe to remove the soil and expose the concrete. The root had grown through the vault lid, penetrated the casket, and, based on the trajectory, had originated from inside the grave itself, not from an existing tree, not from the surrounding oaks, from the body. I opened the vault carefully, documenting each step. The casket's seal was broken, the lid cracked where the root had emerged. Inside, Thomas Greaves's body was partially displaced, pushed aside by the massive root system that had grown from his chest cavity. The growth had split him open, using his rib cage as an anchor point, sending roots downward into the soil and upward through the vault. I'd seen decomposition, seen bodies ravaged by time and nature, but this was different. The root hadn't consumed the body, it had become part of it, grown from it, used it as a seed. I cut the entire root system free, working methodically, despite the copper smell and the way the interior structure looked less like wood with each cut. Removed everything, bagged it, documented it, replaced the casket in a new vault, sealed it with double reinforced concrete, filled the grave. That night, I burned the root sections in my backyard. They burned reluctantly, producing thick black smoke that smelled like hair and metal. The flames were wrong colors, blue and green instead of orange. The ash was red. I filed a final report the next day. Vault failure due to manufacturing defect. Corrected and resealed. No further action required. My supervisor approved it without questions. But I've changed my maintenance patterns. I no longer trim trees near Plot 18. I avoid Section G during my weekly inspections. And when inmates are scheduled for burial in that area, I quietly suggest alternative plots. Because 3 months later, the oak tree nearest to Plot 18 died. Just stopped producing leaves one spring, standing dead and gray while the rest of the cemetery bloomed. I had it removed by a professional tree service. The crew chief called me over when they sectioned the trunk, wanted to show me something unusual in the heartwood. I looked at the cross section and saw what he meant. At the center of that 80-year-old oak, there was a hollow space, finger-sized, dark-stained, still seeping something that looked like old blood. I told him it was probably mineral staining, tree disease, natural decay. He nodded and finished the job, and I never told him about the grave 40 feet from that tree's roots. Some things grow in cemetery soil that were never meant to take root, and some burials plant seeds we'll never fully understand. Bodies don't wait patiently in cold storage, and I learned that from a man who'd been dead for 6 months. My name is Anton Ramirez, and I have worked as a groundskeeper at Clearwater State Penitentiary in western Nevada for 13 years. In that time, I've buried 412 inmates, most within 72 hours of death. The system is efficient. Inmate dies, paperwork processes, burial happens, grave gets marked, clean and quick. But occasionally, bureaucracy intervenes, missing documentation, family disputes, legal holds. Those delays create problems, and Inmate 93265 became the worst delay I'd ever handled. He died in February of 2023, cardiac arrest in the exercise yard. Standard protocol initiated, body to medical examiner, cause of death verified, burial authorization requested, then everything stopped. The hold came from the state attorney's office. Some legal complication involving his conviction, an appeal filed posthumously by advocates, questions about jurisdiction and proper disposition of remains. The body went into cold storage while lawyers argued paperwork. 1 week became 2. 2 became a month. By April, he'd been in refrigeration for 8 weeks. The legal issues finally resolved in late July. 5 months after death, burial authorization came through. The body would be released for interment the following Monday. I prepared the grave on Saturday morning, plot 27 in section C. The ground was hard from summer drought, requiring extra effort to break through the caliche layer. I worked slowly, measuring carefully, making sure everything met specifications. By noon, the grave was ready. Monday morning, the transport team delivered the casket. They moved quickly, professionally, but I noticed their expressions, tight-lipped, uncomfortable. The lead driver handed me the burial authorization and left without the usual small talk. I inspected the casket before burial. Standard pine box, sealed and locked, prisoner number stenciled on the side. Nothing unusual except the smell, sharp and chemical, the heavy odor of industrial preservatives. 5 months in cold storage required aggressive embalming, and apparently the facility had used every chemical available. I lowered the casket at 2 in the afternoon using the mechanical winch. It settled into the vault cleanly, and I began filling the grave. The work was routine: shovel soil, tamp it down, repeat. I'd done it hundreds of times. At 3 feet deep, I stopped for water, set my shovel aside, and walked to the truck for my canteen. When I returned, I noticed something odd: mud on the casket. Fresh, dark mud streaked across the pine surface, visible through the partially filled grave. But the soil I'd been using was dry desert earth, light brown and dusty. This mud was wet, clay, completely different in composition and color. I climbed down into the grave for a closer look. The mud was fresh, still damp, concentrated near the casket's seal. I touched it carefully, cold, sticky, smelling faintly of organic decay. As I examined it, I noticed more mud near the viewing window and beneath the casket's lower edge, like it had come from underneath, from inside. I checked the vault floor. Dry concrete, no water source, no mud. The only mud was on the casket itself, in patterns that suggested it had seeped from the interior. I radioed my supervisor, described the situation. He told me to document it and finish the burial. If the casket was compromised, it was the medical examiner's problem, not ours. My job was to put it in the ground. I took photographs and resumed filling the grave. Worked faster now, wanting to finish and leave. At 5 feet deep, I paused again to check the progress. The mud had spread, more of it coating the casket's surface, dripping down the sides. And now I could see something else: scratches. Thin lines gouged into the pine, concentrated near the seal, like something had dragged nails across the wood from inside. I completed the burial quickly, my hands shaking despite the afternoon heat. Tamped the final layer of soil, placed the temporary marker, cleaned my tools. Then I drove to the office and filed my report. Burial completed. Casket showed signs of deterioration, consistent with extended storage. No further issues noted. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the mud, where it came from, how it got there. The body had been in sealed cold storage for 5 months. Controlled temperature, sterile environment, constant monitoring. There was no source for wet clay mud in a refrigeration unit. The next morning, I returned to plot 27. Told myself I was checking for settling, making sure the grave was properly maintained. But really, I needed to see if anything had changed. The grave was undisturbed, soil packed and level, but at the head of the plot, near the temporary marker, there was a small mound of fresh mud. Dark, wet, clayey, the same mud I'd seen on the casket. I knelt and examined it carefully. It was cool to the touch, recently deposited, still moist. And inside it, I found something that made my breath catch. A clump of cemetery soil. Our cemetery soil, the light brown desert earth from Section C. But this sample was from Plot 42, 40 yards away. I knew because Plot 42 had distinctive reddish mineral content, easily identifiable. I'd buried someone there 3 weeks earlier. I checked the inmate's file when I got back to the office, cross-referenced burial dates and plot numbers. Inmate 9. 3265 had died in February. Inmate in Plot 42 had died in December, 2 months earlier. They'd never known each other. Different cell blocks, different security levels, different conviction dates, no connection whatsoever. Except now, soil from Plot 42 was appearing at Plot 27. I walked out to Plot 42 that afternoon. The grave was undisturbed, properly maintained, no signs of interference. But when I examined the soil closely, I found traces of that dark clay mud mixed into the surface layer, and beneath the mud, fingernail scratches on the temporary metal marker. Over the next week, I found mud at 6 different graves. Always the same dark clay composition, always with traces of soil from other plots mixed in, creating connections between burials that had no logical relationship. I stopped documenting it, stopped investigating, just maintained my normal routine, avoiding Plot 27 during inspections, taking longer routes to bypass Section C. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm locking the equipment shed, I think about that casket, about the mud that appeared on its surface despite 5 months in sealed storage, about the fingernail scratches near the seal, and I think about fresh mud under the fingernails when we received the body, mud that shouldn't exist in a refrigeration unit, mud from a grave 40 yards from where he'd eventually be buried. Like somehow, even in cold storage, he'd already been there, already digging, already trying to reach whatever was waiting beneath the soil. I don't know what that means, don't know what happens to bodies that wait too long for burial. But I've requested that if I die while working here, they bury me within 24 hours. Some delays have consequences, and some bodies refuse to wait patiently for the earth. I count graves every month, and the number is always wrong by exactly 1. My name is Rebecca Reese, and I have worked as a cemetery digger at Stonebridge State Prison in southern Arizona for 7 years. In that time, I've buried 127 inmates, documented every plot, and maintained meticulous records that match the official cemetery ledger perfectly. The job requires precision, plot coordinates, burial dates, inmate numbers all cross-referenced and verified. I take pride in accuracy, which is why the extra grave bothers me so much. I first noticed it during my monthly inspection in March of 2024, Standard procedure: walk every section, count occupied plots, verify against the master ledger, document any discrepancies. The cemetery has 127 graves across 5 sections. I've counted them dozens of times. Always 127. That March morning, I counted 128. I recounted immediately, walking the sections again, using my handheld counter to click off each grave. Section A, 26. Section B, 31. Section C, 28. Section D, 24. Section E, 19. Total, 128. I pulled out the master ledger, cross-referenced every entry. 127 documented burials. No unrecorded plots, no recent additions. The math didn't work. I checked my inspection notes from February. 127 graves, documented and verified. So somewhere between February and March, a grave had appeared. I walked the cemetery again, this time photographing every plot, documenting locations, looking for the extra burial. Everything matched the ledger except for the total count. I couldn't identify which grave was the extra one. They all looked legitimate, all had proper markers, all appeared in expected locations. The discrepancy made no sense. I reported it to my supervisor. He suggested I'd miscounted, that the stress of the job was affecting my accuracy. When I showed him my documentation, he reviewed it carefully and told me the ledger was authoritative. If the ledger said 127, then that was the correct number, but I'd counted 128. I was certain. April's inspection showed the same result, 128 graves. I counted 3 times, used different routes through the sections, verified each plot against photographs from March. The extra grave was still there, but its location had changed. In March, Section D had 24 graves. In April, it had 23. Section C had increased from 28 to 29. The total remained 128, but the distribution had shifted. I documented everything, created detailed maps showing plot locations, cross-referenced with burial records, photographed every marker, spent hours comparing March and April data, trying to identify which grave had moved. I couldn't find it. Every plot in Section C matched the ledger. Every plot in Section D matched the ledger. But somehow, Section C had gained one, and Section D had lost one, maintaining that impossible extra grave. May brought another shift. Section A gained one. Section B lost one. Total, still 128. I stopped reporting it to my supervisor. Started keeping private records in a notebook I kept locked in my truck. Each month, I'd document the count, note which sections had changed, try to identify the migrating grave. The pattern was consistent, always 128 total, always one more than the ledger, always appearing in a different configuration. Like the extra grave was moving through the cemetery, relocating itself between my monthly inspections. In June, I tried a different approach. Instead of counting sections, I photographed every single grave marker, documented every prisoner number, created a comprehensive visual record. Then I cross-referenced against the master ledger. Every marker matched, every prisoner number corresponded to a documented burial. There were no unrecorded graves, no markers for non existent inmates. Yet the total was still 128. I began visiting the cemetery at random times between official inspections, late night checks, early morning walks, midday verifications. I'd count graves spontaneously, trying to catch the extra plot in transition. The count was always correct during these random checks. 127 graves, matching the ledger perfectly. Only during my official monthly inspections did the extra grave appear. July's inspection showed the grave in Section E, fresh-looking plot, wilted flowers on the surface, temporary marker, with a prisoner number I didn't recognize. I photographed everything, documented the marker number 847291. Back in my office, I searched for prisoner 847291. No record. The number didn't exist in the prison system. I checked historical ledgers, archived documents, even old paper files from the 1980s. Nothing. I returned to the plot 2 days later. It was gone. Section E had 19 graves again, and the marker for 847291 had vanished. The spot where I'd photographed it showed undisturbed grass, as if nothing had ever been buried there. August brought a new prisoner number, 623854. September 901247. October 714-389. Each month, the extra grave appeared with a different marker, a different number that never appeared in any records. And each time I returned between inspections, the grave had vanished. I started documenting the flowers. Each extra grave had offerings, wilted carnations, faded roses, sometimes just dried wildflowers. I photographed them, collected samples. The flowers were real, aged naturally, not artificial decorations. Someone was visiting these graves, leaving flowers for prisoners who didn't exist. In November, I stayed overnight in the cemetery, set up a hidden position with a clear view of where the extra grave had appeared during my October inspection, waited from midnight until dawn, watching for visitors. At 3 in the morning, I saw her, a woman in her 60s, carrying white carnations, walking slowly to a grave in Section B. She knelt, placed the flowers carefully, bowed her head for several minutes, then she left, walking back toward the main gate. I waited until she was gone, then approached the grave. Fresh flowers, temporary marker reading 583921, a number I'd documented 3 months earlier when the extra grave had appeared in Section C. I checked the ledger the next morning. Prisoner 583921, no record. I've stopped trying to explain it. The count remains 128 every monthly inspection. The extra grave moves between sections, always with a different prisoner number, always with fresh flowers. And always, when I return later, it's gone. But I've noticed something else. The woman I saw that November night, I've seen her photograph in the prison's memorial garden, a memorial for staff members who died in service. She was a records clerk who worked here in the 1990s, died in a car accident in 2003. 21 years ago, I maintain my official counts carefully now. Document 127 graves in my reports, matching the ledger exactly. But in my private notebook, I track the extra graves' movements, record the prisoner numbers, photograph the flowers, because someone needs to remember these burials, even if they never officially happened. Someone needs to count the graves that appear only when you're looking carefully enough to notice the impossible. The cemetery has 127 documented plots, but every month when I count, there's always one more. And I've learned that some graves exist in the spaces between official records, tended by visitors who never stopped mourning, marking burials that were never supposed to be forgotten. Infrared cameras don't show the living and the dead differently, and I learned that on a Tuesday night in October. My name is David Park, and I have worked as security officer at Millbrook Correctional Facility in upstate New York for 14 years. In that time, I've monitored perimeters, responded to incidents, and logged thousands of hours watching security feeds from cameras positioned throughout the prison grounds. The cemetery sits on the eastern boundary, 3 acres of flat land with 238 graves dating back to 1976. My overnight shift includes periodic visual checks of the camera feeds, 4 cameras covering the cemetery from different angles, including infrared capability for night monitoring. The burial happened at noon on a Tuesday. Inmate 78329, natural causes, standard protocol. I watched the proceedings on camera 3 while eating lunch in the security office. Groundskeeper crew, chaplain, the usual small group. The casket was lowered at 12:17, grave filled by 1:15. Clean, routine, unremarkable. That night, I started my shift at 11, checked all camera feeds, documented everything normal. The cemetery was empty, just rows of headstones and fresh turned earth where the afternoon burial had taken place. Infrared showed clear thermal signatures, ambient ground temperature, slightly cooler air, nothing unusual. At midnight, I did my hourly sweep of all feeds. When I reached camera 3, the angle covering the fresh grave, I stopped. There was someone sitting on the grave. The infrared signature was clear, a human-shaped heat source seated on the fresh soil, completely motionless. I switched to regular optical view, but the cemetery was too dark to see clearly without infrared. Switched back. The figure was still there, unchanged. I checked the access logs. No approved visitors. Gates locked since dusk. Perimeter sensors showed no breaches. Whoever was on that grave had either been there since before lockdown or had entered without triggering any alarms. I called it in to the duty supervisor, then grabbed my flashlight and drove the patrol vehicle out to the cemetery. The route took 4 minutes. I kept my radio on, updating my position, following protocol. When I arrived, the grave was empty. No person, no disturbance, just the freshly filled plot, exactly as the groundskeeper crew had left it. I circled the area with my flashlight, checking for footprints, signs of someone leaving quickly. The ground was undisturbed except for my own boot prints. I documented the scene, took photographs, and returned to the security office, pulled up the camera 3 feet again, reviewed the last 4 minutes of footage from the moment I'd left the building to my arrival at the grave. The figure had remained seated the entire time, not moving, not reacting to my approaching vehicle's headlights. Then, at exactly the moment I'd stepped out of the truck, the thermal signature vanished. Not walking away, not fading gradually, just gone, instant absence where a heat source had been. I filed a report, possible intruder, no physical evidence found, incident documented on camera. The supervisor reviewed the footage and told me to increase cemetery patrols. When I pointed out that the figure had disappeared impossibly, he suggested thermal reflection or camera malfunction. I didn't argue, but I started watching camera 3 more carefully during night shifts. The figure appeared again 3 nights later. Same position, seated on the grave, same thermal signature, showing human body temperature. This time, I didn't drive out immediately. Instead, I watched. The figure sat motionless for 11 minutes. Then it stood, smoothly, naturally, exactly like a living person rising from seated position. And it started walking, slowly, deliberately. It moved between the graves, following the cemetery's main path toward the southern section. The thermal signature remained constant, human temperature clearly visible on infrared. I switched cameras, tracking its progress. Camera 4 picked it up as it entered the southern section. Camera 1 showed it passing through the older graves. Then it stopped at a specific plot. Row 14, grave marker for an inmate who died 6 years earlier. The figure stood there for several minutes before sitting down on that grave. I checked the burial records. The inmate in row 14 had been cellmates with the man buried that Tuesday. They'd shared a cell for 2 years before the first one died. The connection was documented in the file. The figure remained on the old grave for 20 minutes before standing again and walking back to the fresh burial. Sat down in the original position and became still. At dawn, when the sun rose and I switched from infrared to optical cameras, the figure vanished. This pattern repeated every night for 2 weeks, always appearing at midnight, always sitting on the fresh grave first, always visiting the old cellmate's plot in row 14, always returning before dawn. I stopped filing reports, started documenting privately, taking screenshots, logging times and movements. The thermal signature was consistent, showing standard human body temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. No fluctuation, no anomalies that would suggest equipment malfunction. During week 3, I drove out during one of the visits, approached quietly, parked at a distance, watched with binoculars. Camera feed showed the figure clearly, seated on the fresh grave. My optical view showed empty cemetery. No person, no disturbance. I walked directly to the grave, watching my handheld radio's screen showing the live camera 3 feed. The figure was visible on camera, seated exactly where I was standing, but I was alone. I reached out, moved my hand through the space where the thermal signature showed a human torso. Nothing, just cold October air. On camera, the figure remained undisturbed, my hand passing through it without interaction. I returned to my vehicle and watched the rest of the visit on the monitors. The figure completed its routine, walk to row 14, sit, return, wait for dawn. I pulled the burial records for both inmates, found their correspondence logs. Over 2 years of cellmate assignment, they'd developed what the prison psychologist called institutional family bonds. The older inmate had mentored the younger one, helped him earn his GED, advocated for his parole hearings. When the older inmate died, the younger one had requested to attend the burial. Request denied. Security protocol prohibited inmate attendance at cemetery services. He'd written a letter to the chaplain asking that his cellmate not be buried alone, that someone should sit with him. No one had. 6 years later, that younger inmate died and was buried in the cemetery. And now, every night at midnight, a thermal signature walks from the fresh grave to the old one and keeps the vigil that was denied in life. I've stopped trying to explain it. The cameras show it clearly. The physics are impossible, but the documentation is solid. Every night, the same routine. Sometimes when I'm watching, I think about two men in a cell, finding family in a place designed to isolate them. About promises made that extend beyond death. I've requested the night shift permanently now. Someone should witness this, even if they can't explain it. Someone should document that some bonds survive even separation by 6 years and 6 feet of earth. The thermal signature appears every night at midnight. I log it as routine cemetery activity. My supervisor stopped asking questions months ago, and sometimes, watching that figure walk between graves on infrared, I wonder, when I die, will anyone care enough to keep vigil? Will anyone sit on my grave and refuse to let me be alone? The cameras show what they show, and some things are real even when you can't see them with your own eyes. The chaplain blesses the same grave every Thursday, and when I asked him why, his answer stopped me cold. My name is Thomas Wade, and I have worked as a groundskeeper at Riverside State Prison Cemetery in northern Michigan for 16 years. In that time, I've maintained that the 347 graves, managed seasonal landscaping, and learned to recognize the rhythms of grief. Some families visit weekly. Some visit once and never return. Some send flowers on birthdays and death anniversaries, maintaining connection across years. But Chaplain Morris visits Plot 83 every Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, and he's been doing it for 7 months. I first noticed him in late March of 2024. I was trimming hedges near Section F when I saw him walking toward the newer graves, prayer book in hand, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who'd made this journey many times. He stopped at Plot 83, bowed his head, and began reciting a blessing. I recognized the cadence, a standard prayer for the dead, the same one used at burial services. I continued my work, not wanting to intrude on a private moment. The chaplain finished his prayer, stood quietly for a few minutes, then walked back to the main building. The whole visit lasted maybe 15 minutes. The following Thursday, he was there again. Same time, same plot, same prayer. I was working in a different section, but could see him clearly. Same routine, same reverent posture, same measured departure. By the third Thursday, I was curious enough to check the burial records. Plot 83, Inmate 42786, buried in late August of 2023. Cause of death, suicide. No family, no service beyond the chaplain's standard graveside blessing. Standard protocol for unclaimed inmates. The burial had happened 7 months before I noticed Chaplain Morris's Thursday visits. I started paying attention. Every Thursday at 2, without fail, the chaplain appeared. Rain, snow, heat, didn't matter. He came, said his prayer, stayed for a few minutes, left. I'd worked with Chaplain Morris for over a decade. He was professional, kind, dedicated to his work. But this level of commitment to a single grave seemed unusual. In May, I approached him after one of his visits, asked if everything was all right, if he needed anything from grounds maintenance. He smiled, thanked me for my diligence, and started walking away. I asked why he came every Thursday. He stopped, turned back to face me. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he said quietly, "He keeps asking me to." I thought I'd misheard, asked him to repeat it. The inmate. "He keeps asking me to come, so I do." The chaplain said it matter-of-factly, the way someone might explain a routine appointment. Then he nodded politely and walked back toward the prison. I stood there in the afternoon sun, trying to process what I'd heard. The inmate had been dead for 7 months. He couldn't ask for anything. But Chaplain Morris had spoken with complete sincerity, no indication he was joking or speaking metaphorically. I checked the chaplain's schedule for the following Thursday. He had it blocked off, 2 to 2:30, marked simply cemetery visit. That Thursday, I positioned myself near plot 83 before 2 o'clock, pretended to inspect nearby markers while waiting for the chaplain to arrive. He appeared right on schedule, walking his usual path, prayer book in hand. I watched carefully as he approached the grave. He stopped, bowed his head, and began his prayer. I couldn't hear the words from my distance, but I recognized the rhythm. Standard blessing for the dead, nothing unusual. Then he paused mid-prayer, tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Not prayer cadence, more like conversation, like he was responding to someone. After a minute, he nodded slowly, resumed his prayer, finished it properly, stood in silence for his usual few minutes, then departed. I walked to plot 83 after he left. The grave was unremarkable, standard temporary marker, well-maintained grass, no flowers or offerings, nothing to suggest any unusual activity. I stood there for 10 minutes, listening, silence, just wind through the trees and distant prison sounds. The following week, I arrived earlier, positioned myself where I could clearly observe the chaplain's entire visit. He appeared at 2, began his prayer, paused at the same point. This time I was close enough to hear him. "Yes, I understand," he said quietly, in the middle of his prayer. "I'll come back next Thursday." He wasn't speaking to anyone visible. His eyes were closed, head bowed, facing the grave. but his tone was conversational, responsive, like he was engaged in dialogue. I approached him after he finished, asked directly, "Chaplain Morris, who are you talking to?" He looked at me calmly. "The inmate in Plot 83. He asks me to visit each week, so I come. It's the least I can do." I asked how the inmate was communicating. The chaplain considered this, then said, "I hear him during the prayer, not with my ears exactly, but I hear him nonetheless. He's quite clear about wanting company." The chaplain excused himself and left. I remained at the grave, trying to understand. Pulled the inmate's file that evening, looking for context. The inmate had hanged himself in his cell. The suicide note was brief. "Nobody came when I called. Nobody ever came." Prison records showed he'd submitted multiple request forms for chaplain visits during his final month. All were processed normally, added to the chaplain's schedule, but due to a clerical error, they'd been assigned to a different chaplain who'd been on medical leave. The visits never happened. When Chaplain Morris discovered the error after the death, he'd been devastated. He'd submitted a formal review, accepted responsibility for the failed communication, requested additional administrative oversight. The report noted his deep remorse over the missed visits. And now, 7 months later, he was making those visits every Thursday without fail. I've watched him for months now. The pattern never varies. 2 o'clock Thursday, the prayer, the pause, the quiet conversation, the promise to return. I've stopped questioning it, stopped trying to understand the mechanism, because I've noticed something else. The grass around Plot 83 grows differently than surrounding graves. Healthier, greener, even in winter when everything else browns. Like something about those weekly blessings is feeding the soil. And sometimes, when I'm working near Section F on Thursday afternoons, I swear I can feel it. Not see it, not hear it, but feel it. A presence at Plot 83, waiting patiently for 2 o'clock, waiting for the chaplain who finally answered the call. Chaplain Morris will retire next year. He's already arranged for his replacement to continue the Thursday visits, made it part of the official transition documentation. When I asked if he'd explained why, he said simply, "A promise is a promise, even after death." Every Thursday at 2, the chaplain keeps an appointment with a man who died calling for someone to come. And now someone does, every week. Without fail, some debts survive death, and some chaplains refuse to leave their congregants alone, even when those congregants rest 6 feet beneath cemetery soil. Fresh flowers don't bloom in February, especially not in frozen cemetery ground where nothing should grow. My name is Sarah Jin, and I have worked as caretaker at Northfield State Prison Cemetery in northern Vermont for 11 years. In that time, I've managed 419 burials, maintained grounds through brutal winters, and learned that Vermont soil stays frozen solid from December through March. Nothing grows during those months. The grass browns and dies back. The trees stand bare. Even hardy perennials wait for spring, which is why the sunflowers at Plot 115 made no sense. I first noticed them on a Monday morning in mid-February. I was conducting my weekly winter inspection, checking for frost heave damage, documenting ice on pathways, verifying that temporary markers hadn't shifted during freeze-thaw cycles. The temperature was 17 degrees Fahrenheit, snow from the previous week still covering most of the cemetery in crusty patches. Plot 1. 15 held an inmate who died in late January, buried during a brief warm spell that had softened the ground enough for digging. Standard winter burial, quick service, minimal attendance, frozen earth packed hard around the vault. I'd supervised it personally 3 weeks earlier. Now there were sunflowers growing there. 3 of them, tall and healthy, bright yellow petals vivid against the snow. They stood upright, fully bloomed, showing no signs of frost damage, despite temperatures that should have killed them instantly. I approached slowly, convinced I was seeing artificial decorations someone had placed as a memorial. But they were real, living plants. I could see the stems flex slightly in the wind, see moisture on the petals, see the leaves showing normal green color. I touched one carefully, warm, impossibly warm, like it was growing in July sunshine instead of February cold. I checked the visitor logs. The cemetery had been closed since Friday afternoon, locked for the weekend. No approved visitors, no recorded entries, and the prison had strict policies about grave decorations, artificial flowers allowed during approved visit times, live plants prohibited. I photographed the flowers extensively, documenting their condition, the surrounding snow, the frozen ground. Then I checked the burial records. Plot 1. 15. Inmate 96423. Died January 27th. Natural causes, heart failure, no next of kin listed. Standard unmarked burial. I filed a report with my supervisor. Unexplained live flowers at plot 115. Possible unauthorized visitor. Investigation needed. He reviewed my photographs and told me to remove them. Protocol required clearing all grave decorations after 72 hours. I returned to the plot that afternoon with clippers. The sunflowers were still there, unchanged, still impossibly healthy in 17-degree weather. I cut them at ground level and took them to my office for disposal. The next morning, they were back. Same location, same plot, 3 fresh sunflowers standing tall in frozen ground. I checked the stems I'd cut the previous day. They were lying in my office trash can, wilted now, browning. But new ones had grown overnight, full-sized, fully bloomed. I documented everything again, photographed the new flowers, verified they weren't the ones I'd removed, checked for disturbances in the snow around the plot. No footprints, no signs of anyone planting anything, just flowers that had appeared between sunset and dawn in ground frozen too hard to dig. I left them in place and set up a wildlife camera aimed at the plot. If someone was planting flowers overnight, I'd catch them on video. The camera recorded nothing. 12 hours of footage showing empty cemetery, falling snow, darkness, no visitors, no movement except wind-blown branches. But in the final frame at dawn, the sunflowers were there, 3 bright spots of impossible summer color. I reviewed the footage frame by frame. Between 2:47 and 2:48 in the morning, the flowers simply appeared. not growing gradually, not being planted, just suddenly present, as if they'd materialized from nothing. I called the State Agricultural Extension Office, described the situation without mentioning the impossibility, asked if any sunflower varieties could survive Vermont winters. The specialist laughed and said sunflowers were heat loving annuals that died at first frost. What I was describing was biologically impossible. I stopped removing the flowers. They appeared weekly now, every Monday morning. Always 3 sunflowers, always fresh, always impossibly healthy, despite temperatures dropping to single digits and below zero. In March, when the ground began to thaw, I examined the plot more carefully. The sunflowers were growing from exactly the same spots each time, 3 points forming a triangle around the grave marker. I used a probe to check the soil depth at these points. 18 inches down, the ground was warm. Not air temperature, but warm like soil in summer. I used a soil thermometer, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, at 18 inches, while the surface soil was 32 degrees. Something beneath plot 115 was generating heat. I requested permission to examine the burial vault. My supervisor denied it, said there was no justification for disturbing a grave because of unusual plant growth. When I explained the thermal anomaly, he suggested groundwater or geological features. But I pulled the inmate's file anyway, looked for anything that might explain this. Inmate 96423 had been a horticulture worker during his incarceration, maintained the prison's greenhouse for 12 years, grew flowers for the warden's office, taught other inmates gardening skills. His specialty had been sunflowers. The prison newspaper had featured him in an article about the therapeutic value of gardening programs. He'd died 1 week before the greenhouse's annual spring planting. His favorite sunflower seeds, a variety he'd cultivated himself, were still stored in the greenhouse, labeled with his prisoner number. I obtained samples of those seeds through the prison's education department, compared them to the flowers growing on his grave. They matched perfectly. Same variety, same characteristics, same distinctive petal pattern. The flowers continued appearing throughout spring, even when natural sunflowers began blooming across Vermont in July. The ones at plot 115 were different, larger, healthier, blooming every Monday regardless of weather. In August, I noticed something new. Other graves in Section J were showing unusual plant growth. Small flowers, herbs, vegetables, all varieties the inmate had grown in the greenhouse. Like his influence was spreading, turning the cemetery into the garden he'd tended for 12 years. I've stopped documenting it officially. Just maintain the grounds, allow the plants to grow, note privately which graves are developing green spaces. The cemetery has never looked more alive, especially in winter when impossible sunflowers bloom against the snow. Last Monday, I found a tomato plant growing near plot 115 in February in Vermont, with ripe red tomatoes hanging from frost-free vines. I picked one and tasted it. It was perfect, sweet and warm, like August sunshine condensed into fruit. I leave them now. The sunflowers, the tomatoes, the herbs that appear in frozen ground. Other staff members have noticed but nobody questions it. The cemetery feels different now, less like a place of endings, more like a garden waiting for spring. And in every Monday morning, I check plot 115 for new flowers. They're always there, three bright sunflowers marking the grave of a man who spent 12 years teaching others how things grow. Some gardens outlive the gardener, and some seeds take root in places we never expected, blooming in seasons that should be impossible. The burial file was stamped deceased 1987, but I buried him yesterday, and the photograph proves I've done this before. My name is Michael Callahan, and I have worked as cemetery digger at Westbrook State Penitentiary in Eastern Oregon for 23 years. In that time, I've handled 741 burials, processed thousands of documents, and learned that paperwork errors happen regularly in institutional systems. Dates get transposed, files get misfiled, clerical mistakes occur. But when I received the burial order for Inmate 34897 on a Wednesday morning in November, the date stamp made me stop. Deceased, March 14th, 1987. The burial was scheduled for Thursday, November 12th, 2024, 37 years after the documented death date. I checked the file 3 times. Everything appeared standard: medical examiner's report, death certificate, burial authorization, except that death date, March 14th, 1987. The certificates had proper signatures, official seals, correct formatting, not photocopies or reproductions. Original documents, yellowed with age. I called the administrative office, explained the discrepancy. The clerk put me on hold, came back 5 minutes later, and confirmed clerical error, update the records, proceed with burial. When I asked how a clerical error could involve original documents from 1987, she repeated that I should update the records and proceed. I documented the anomaly in my personal log and prepared the grave. Section M, Plot 63. Standard depth, standard vault. Nothing unusual about the location or specifications. The body arrived Thursday morning in a transport van. The driver handed me the paperwork, mentioned the casket was heavier than usual, and left quickly. I inspected the casket before burial. Standard metal box, sealed and locked, showing signs of age. Not new construction, but not damaged, like it had been in storage for a very long time. I lowered it at 10 in the morning, filled the grave, placed the temporary marker. The whole process felt routine until I returned to my office and noticed the envelope on my desk. Plain manila envelope, no markings, no postage, just sitting there on my otherwise empty desk. Inside was a photograph. The image showed me standing beside a grave in Section M, holding a shovel, dirt on my boots. Same work clothes I was wearing, same equipment, same Section M background clearly visible. But the photograph was old, not digital print, but actual film development on photo paper, edges yellowed, surface showing age patterns. I turned it over, written on the back in faded ink, M. Callahan, Plot 63, March 14th, 1987. My name, the plot I'd just filled, the date stamped on the burial file. I studied the photograph carefully. The man in the image looked exactly like me. Same face, same build, same age. Not younger, not older. Exactly as I appeared in the mirror that morning, wearing the same work shirt with my name patch visible. But I hadn't worked at Westbrook in 1987. I was 12 years old in 1987, living 300 miles away in California. I didn't start at Westbrook until 2001, 14 years after the photograph was supposedly taken. I checked the personnel files. Michael Callahan, employed as cemetery digger since 2001. No previous employment at Westbrook. No record of any other Michael Callahan working here in the 1980s. I drove back to Plot 63, comparing the photograph to the actual grave. The angle matched perfectly. The background trees were the same, though older now. The grave marker position was identical. Someone had photographed this exact burial in 1987, and the person in that photograph was me. I requested the original burial records for Plot 63. The filing system required archived paperwork for anything pre-2000 stored in the basement records room. I spent 2 hours searching through boxes of yellowed documents, filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in decades. I found the file for Plot 63, burial dated March 14th, 1987. Inmate 34897. Same prisoner number as yesterday's burial. The paperwork was identical. Same medical examiner signatures, same authorization codes, same notes in the margin, and at the bottom of the file, another photograph. Same image I'd found on my desk. Me, standing beside a grave I'd filled 37 years before I was employed there. The photograph had been filed in 1987. I checked the inmate's original death records. March 14th, 1987. Cause of death, natural causes. Transport log showed body delivered to cemetery. Burial completed same day. Signed by groundskeeper M. Callahan. I compared the signature to my own. Identical. My handwriting, my signature style, the way I formed letters. Not similar. Exact. That night, I went through my personal effects at home. Found my old work journals, daily logs I'd kept since starting at Westbrook in 2001. Started with the first entry, looking for anything unusual, any gaps in memory, any indication of time I couldn't account for. On March 14th, 2001, 14 years after the original burial, I'd written, "Strange dream last night, digging a grave in Section M, Plot 63, felt real, woke up exhausted." I hadn't remembered that entry, hadn't thought about it in 23 years. But there it was, dated exactly 14 years after the 1987 burial. I pulled the cemetery's master burial ledger, found Plot 63, listed occupant, inmate 34897, buried March 14th, 1987, groundskeeper, signature M. Callahan. No record of yesterday's burial. The plot was officially occupied 37 years ago, signed for by me 14 years before I worked there. I returned to Plot 63 this morning, stood at the grave, looking at the fresh earth I'd tamped down yesterday, the temporary marker I'd placed. the work I'd completed less than 48 hours ago. According to every official record, this burial happened in 1987. According to the photograph filed that year, I was there. According to my memory, I buried this inmate yesterday. I've stopped trying to reconcile it. The file exists, the photograph exists, the signature exists, and yesterday I buried a man who officially died 37 years ago in a plot that's been occupied since 1987. Tonight, I found another envelope on my desk. Another photograph, me standing beside a different grave. Section L, Plot 41. The back reads, M. Sir Callahan, Plot 41, June 8th, 1991. I checked the burial schedule. Inmate scheduled for Plot 41. For 41 tomorrow. Death certificate dated June 8th, 1991. I was 16 years old in 1991, living in California, not employed at Westbrook. But tomorrow I'll dig that grave. I'll lower that casket. I'll sign the paperwork with handwriting that matches documents filed 33 years ago. And somewhere, somehow, I've already done this, will do this, am doing this. Time doesn't work the way I thought it did. And some burials happen in moments that fold back on themselves, creating loops where the past and present occupy the same grave. I'll dig Plot 41 tomorrow. I've been digging it for 33 years. And the photograph from 1991 sits on my desk, showing me exactly as I'll appear tomorrow, standing beside a grave I filled decades before I was born into this moment. Some jobs we repeat forever. Some graves we dig in time that circles back. And some of us are groundskeepers in moments that refuse to end.